the long and winding road that leads to your door will never disappear. I've seen that road before. It always leads me here. Lead me to your...
Hello lads, John Lennon here. I'm rhythm guitar and mouth organ, and I was also the founding member of the Beatles, I guess. This is Ringo Starr. Of course, I'm the drummer.
Has left a pool of tears, crying for the day.
Hello, this is Paul McCartney. I did a bit of rhythm guitar, even though I'm mainly the bass player.
Leave me standing here. Let me know.
George Harrison here on lead guitar, and I've also written a few songs of my own.
And many times
And together we are
anyway,
the Beatles.
the many ways I've tried, and still leaving back to the long, winding road. You left me standing here a long, long time ago. Don't leave me waiting here. Lead me to...
Well, I'm glad you were able to come here, Mr. Klucherosky. Welcome to the Abbey Road Studios, and in fact, the lads are in there waiting for you. Number 2 studio. That's where the magic was made.
Well, thank you very much for having me. If I could just put some general introductions into what we're hoping to accomplish here. I am a person who is 44 years old, and up until last year, I appreciated the Beatles, but didn't necessarily have a strong connection to them. What happened is I was able to see the Get Back documentary, and in watching those couple hours, really for the first time in my life, saw the magic. And so now having that feeling, I want to learn as much as I can about the Beatles, starting from the very beginning.
Well, what better place to do it at the than here at the studio where most of the magic was made?
So we're very lucky today. What
bef-
we have is the ability to speak to a Beatles aficionado who is channeling the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
In case you're wondering vocally who I am, my name is George Martin, and I was their record producer for pretty much every single and album they had done.
George, I can't thank you enough for allowing this to happen. It's my hope that we can begin a journey, and that this is a journey that goes on for a while, and in the process really start to understand completely the importance of this group that is timeless and that has influenced music for the better in so many countless ways. So I think, George, when you're ready, I'm ready to go in and meet John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
Well, good thing they're all here. Hello, lads. John Lennon here. Obviously, I was I'm rhythm guitar and mouth organ, and I was also the founding member of the Beatles, I guess. Hello, this is Paul McCartney. I did a bit of rhythm guitar, even though I'm mainly the bass player. George Harrison here. I'm on lead guitar, and I've also written a few songs of my own. This is Ringo Starr. Of course, I'm the drummer. And together we are the Beatles.
It is a pleasure to meet you all. A pleasure to know that you're willing to talk to me about your entire history as a group. I have so many questions.
As long as you don't ask them all at once.
I can promise you that. Let me start then with the first question. And John, this is directed towards you. What was the official starting point for the Beatles?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked. Well, the official date is actually the first day I met, would actually go down to the day I first met Paul, which was on July the 6th of 1957, actually. Paul met me the first day I sang Bebop Balula live on stage that day, and a mutual friend of ours brought him to see my group called the Quarrymen. And we met and we talked after the show, and I saw he had talent. He was playing guitar backstage, doing the song called 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. I think that what really impressed John the most is that I knew all the chords and the words to the song.
Tell me a little bit, John, about your group, the Quarrymen.
We all went to the same high school, which was Quarry Bank. Most of us didn't really have too much musical training.
How many members were in the Quarrymen?
Well, until Paul joined, there were about 5 of us. But at Paul's audition, that backstage performance, I was impressed, and I thought, is it better to have someone who's better than me and the others in this group, or not? So I turned around to him right there on first meeting and said, "Do you want to join the group?" I think he said yes the next day.
Paul, let me ask you, what did you think when you were backstage and here comes the front man for the Quarrymen, and he asks you to essentially play?
He was mainly interested in seeing what I had to offer. But what surprised John the most was the fact I was left-handed, so I was playing the guitar upside down.
Paul, let me ask you about that. I hear from a lot of guitar players who are left-handed, and many of them do similar to what you said. What was it like for you to pick up a guitar with the left hand? How did you teach yourself?
The way I learned the chords was, obviously I had to do it reversed, upside down. Oh no, and that's actually how John picked up some of the chords I knew. Is basically he had to then transcribe them on his right-handed guitar.
Now, Paul, were you at that time, that night, were you looking for a group to join?
At first I thought that was just a pipe dream, but when John asked me to join that night, I mean, I wasn't going to turn that offer down. He was officially part of the group starting the following day.
By the way, Ringo, George, we are not ignoring you by any stretch. This is the beginning.
Don't worry, we understand. Well, don't forget, they're going through about 5 more years before I was in the band.
So true, Ringo. But we will be with you sooner than you realize. So, John, this question goes back to you. Now you have Paul. How does that change things with the Quarrymen?
Well, basically, we had a little bit more musical power to it, in one way, because he knew a lot more than what the rest of us knew. And he was able to help us out a bit.
How did the other members of the Quarrymen take to Paul coming in?
Well, at first they were a little opposed to having an outsider be part of the group, but once they saw how well he was doing, and they wouldn't. And since I was the leader, they weren't going to oppose me. Yeah.
So, Paul, did you feel accepted by the Quarrymen?
For the most part, yes.
So,
I think only one of them didn't like me.
Care to give those details?
No. What details are there to give? He just wasn't that comfortable with me.
So let me ask you, the Quarrymen were in need, and you found out, Paul, this pretty quick. They were in need of a lead guitarist.
That's right, and that's where George came in.
So, Paul, you knew a lead guitarist.
That's right, and because George and we both attended the same school, except I'm about 9 months older than him. But nevertheless, a friendship formed pretty quickly.
How did Paul approach you about auditioning for the Quarrymen?
I had to be prepared to, answer to do whatever song that John was gonna have me do. And fortunately, he happened to pick one song that I still know how to play pretty much perfectly. It was a song called Raunchy. Raunchy goes like down, 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 down. And the audition was like on the top of a double-decker bus late at night, and it was just the three of us.
Let me see if I get that right. You're telling me that you auditioned for the Quarrymen on the top of a bus in the evening. So
it might hard to believe, but that's how it happened.
Seems like a little foreshadowing of rooftop performances.
If you're talking about the one that we did years later in January of '69.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was foreshadowing necessarily. But fortunately, the reason we were able to get on it is because my father was driving it.
I did not know that. So, George, your father was the bus driver.
Exactly at that time. I was the youngest of 4 kids. Lived up in a 2-up and 2-down, number 12 Arnold Grove, which is where I was born. My dad had wanted me to be something like an electrician. My mom encouraged my musical interest, and my dad wasn't gonna. He knew better than to pick a fight with her.
This tips back over to John just for a minute, and then we'll come back to the audition. John, you already had a lead guitarist for the Quarrymen, so
actually, no, I didn't. Yeah, and I knew I needed one, and but I had to see if George could actually handle the load, could actually rise up to the challenge, and sure enough, he got his guitar out and played the song, and he didn't miss a note. I was just floored because despite his youth, despite his young age, he was an expert already, even further ahead than Paul and me combined. And so right there, I decided, you hit that song perfectly. George, you're in. And at that moment, I booted the others out.
So that is a very interesting moment. So you knew at that point George was in. You have Paul. You obviously have yourself, but you make a decision to part ways with the other members of the Quarrymen. Tell us how that all went down.
Well, while they did continue on, they never went further than Liverpool. And of course, as you know, the three of us plus Ringo went further.
Whatever happened? Did you ever maintain touch? Obviously, as you guys became who you became, did you ever bump back into the members?
Well, I did keep in touch with actually the mutual friend who introduced Paul and me. We both kept in touch with him. His name was Ivan Vaughn. He remained our close friend. I also kept close relations with another member of the group, Pete Shotton. He later went on to become a teacher, but in his off hours he would still be doing it with the band.
So interesting.
Well, once the three of us were together, it was a pretty crummy recording session, but it was in Kensington, I think. But we finally were able to put something down on record. It was a shellac disc, which unfortunately isn't quite as good as vinyl, but nevertheless, on there came the first thing we ever recorded, which first was on the A side was a cover of "That'll Be the Day," Buddy Holly's song, and also one of Paul's called "In Spite of All the Danger." I think George Martin actually has got the recording up there in the studio. Isn't that right, George? Yes, as a matter of fact, I do.
John, let me ask you one quick question. Once you have Paul, now you have George. What did you call yourselves?
Oh, you mean in terms of names? Well, after the Quarrymen, we experimented with a few others. One of them was called the Blackjacks. Then we did Johnny and the Moondogs. Then after a couple more members joined, including Stu Sutcliffe on bass and Pete Best as the drummer, we decided to alter our identities as well, calling ourselves Long John Lennon and the Silver Beatles. Yeah, we all got in on that. I was Paul Ramon. I was Carl Harrison, heavily influenced by Carl Perkins, and Stuart became Stuart the Style. Because after a French artist at the time. Stuart sold a painting at one of the exhibitions, and the amount. But the question is, what do you do with 75 quid? And we knew that was the price of a bass guitar, and he bought it. The only trouble was he didn't really know how to play it. But at the time, it was better to have a bass player who couldn't play than to not have one at all. One other thing that Stuart actually helped introduce to us was our famous mop top haircuts. He was the first to undergo that transformation, and I thought that he looked good in it. He said, "Do you think you'd do the same thing to the rest of us?" And we talked to the stylist, and he said, "Yeah." And the only one who refused to adopt that, the only one of us who didn't really follow through with that was Pete Best, the drummer.
What was Pete's name in the band?
They didn't. He didn't change his name. He felt that his name was good enough anyway. But not long afterwards, Stuart felt he was a bit of an outsider, and he decided to leave and stay in Germany with his girlfriend Astrid, who took most of those early pictures of us. And of course now we didn't have a bass player, so so I took over, and while we were in Germany, I came across this one interesting looking bass guitar that almost looked like a violin. And it was from the Hofner company. And fortunately, I did have enough to get it. So little did I know that instrument would forever be associated with me.
So, Paul, if Stewart doesn't leave the band, you might not have gone on to play bass.
That's true, even though it wasn't my first choice, but someone had to do it, and since I was pretty good at piano anyway, and bass strings were a lot like piano strings, so I just went for it, as long as, and actually because of the design of that Hofner bass, it almost looked symmetrical, so it didn't matter which way I was playing it. Although I am and always will be left-handed.
Here's a question. How did you land on the name The Beatles?
Well, we were trying to look for, a name to establish ourselves. I originally thought of the name The Crickets, but then I remembered that name was already taken by Buddy Holly's backing group. And then someone thought of, from Crickets, I got the Beatles, but then I thought, but why don't we spell it differently? So we can establish, because that would really make an impact. So it's like someone saying you're Beatles with an A, and we are. And so from that point on, we spelled it Beatles. And when it comes to the names, the rest is history.
As the Beatles, at that point, you did not have management just yet.
Yes, we were playing actually at this place called the Cavern Club in Liverpool, on Matthew Street. Someone had gone into this record store called Ems, which was owned by Brian Epstein, requesting this one song that we had recorded when we were in Germany called My Bonnie with Tony Sheridan. We were just the instrumental backing, but someone requested it, and his receptionist happened to know that the backing group they were talking about, that they were actually talking about, was us. And so Brian trucked down to Matthew Street, and then the DJ Bob Wooler announced that he was there, and they gave him a round of applause, and then we actually decided to perform on Stand By Me for him, and he must have been quite impressed, because the next thing we knew, he offered to be our actual manager.
At that point, Mr. Epstein wanted to manage the Beatles.
That's right. In fact, I believe there's an archival or recording of him, because he mentions how we go for. He mentioned we went for auditioning for several record labels in 1962, and most of them turned us down because they thought guitar groups are on the way out. But then he had one last chance at EMI, specifically the Parlophone label, and it was just by chance that he met at the man who would actually serve as our record producer from that point until the end. And George Martin, and that was quite an occasion meeting all of them. One thing I was definitely impressed with was their sense of humor, actually, and they actually knew that I'd also produced comedy albums like Peter Sellers and the Goons, so that was so we instantly hit it off there.
So, George, let me pause for a second. This is so fascinating, but I feel if I don't ask Ringo a question, he's probably going to leave the studio.
Well, actually, I still got a little bit of time left.
Thanks, Ringo. I wanted to ask all four of you the same question, and I think, Ringo, it would be great if you started off. And the question is, what drew you into music? What was it about rock and roll that was so important to you back then?
Well, for me, it provided a means of escapism, and it was like a way of expressing yourself that none of the other genres could. That was the same for me, Ringo. But to tell you the truth, I had no idea about doing music as a way of life until rock and roll hit me. And when rock and roll hit me, that changed my whole life. No further comment from me. Yeah, me neither. It was the same. It was pretty much the same thing for all of us.
Well, John and Paul, I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy. I want to ask you a question, a follow-up question that may expand on that. What was home life like for you back then?
Oh, now you've hit one of the big ones. Tell you the truth, I spent some time with my mother up till about like 4, because my father had split. He was a merchant seaman, and you can imagine it was 1940s and the war and all that. But anyway, he left, and I was brought up by my aunt Mimi, my mother's older sister. When I was 16, I reestablished a relationship with my mother, and she actually was the one who got me into music. And she first of all taught me the banjo, and from that I progressed to guitar. And then unfortunately she was run over by an off-duty policeman who was drunk at the time in July of '58, and that was very hard on me because I had lost her twice. One when I moved in with my aunt, and the second time was the permanent one, which happened just as I was reestablishing a relationship with her. And that was very, very hard for me, and it made me just very, very bitter. And I basically, that was the rock and roll was the only outlet I had.
That is just so compelling.
And I knew what John was going through because I had lost my mother as well. Not to a drunk cop, but she had cancer. Ended up dying when I was 14. So John and I, in a way, we were in the same boat.
So music
was the only way we could express ourselves about that grief. Even though in fact, one of the songs on the White Album, the last one on them, I think side 2 of the first record, Julia, that was my mother's name. I wrote that song for her, and of course my mother was Mary. Yeah, in fact, she's the one who I referenced in Let It Be.
That is just all I can say is thank you for sharing that. Let me go to lighten the mood with a question for Ringo. Ringo, I'm curious about, and I know this is jumping ahead, but it's a question that I want to ask, and that is, how did your involvement with Thomas the Tank come about?
Well, that was way after the Beatles. I don't know where. Actually, to tell you the truth, I had actually never read the Railway series when I was a kid. But the producer of the program, Britt Allcroft, actually spoke with me a couple of times about it, and finally I decided I would do a straight narration of like the first major stories, and if she and I said, well, if you need me again, I'll just give me a call. As it turns out, she still did. The only reason I left after the Railway series and Thomas and Shining Time Station afterwards was nothing against Britt Allcroft, nor against the Reverend W. Awdry, who was the original author. I just had a desire to return to my musical roots.
Thank you for indulging me with that question. So, George, this is a question I want to give to you. You've mentioned now you have 4 gentlemen in your studio, but you don't have the Beatles as what we know the Beatles would become. Is that correct?
That is correct. While Paul, John, and I were in place, we still didn't have Ringo yet, and I think to answer that question of how he came in permanently, I think we better turn it over to Ringo himself. Well, it was a Wednesday, and Brian Epstein called me up, and he said, well, will you join the band? And I was like, are you serious? And he said, no, really, permanently join the Beatles. And I said, sure. And I said, when? And he said, now. Well, I said, well, I can't do it right now, because I've got to give the band I was in at that time some advance notice. I tell you what, I'll join you first thing on Saturday. And by mid-August, we were all together.
Let me back up just a minute to George Martin. So, George, talk a little bit about your experience of the Beatles the first time. And I think that we should point out you did not experience Ringo Starr during that first audition.
Well, that's true. That was Pete Best. And actually, one of the treasures we did on the Earth recently at the studio was actually the very first recorded take of Love Me Do, which had Pete at the drums. But obviously, it was apparent that it just lacked what was needed.
What was missing with Pete and his drumming?
Well, his drumming was just very, very, very basic, but and Ringo had a much more. Ringo was basically able to not only keep the beat, but he also was able to do the fills and whatever was necessary. We did do a take that had Ringo at the kit, and that actually turned out to be the very first pressing of Love Me Do, when it was turned into a single, because we were originally going to use a different take in which Ringo was only a tambourine, which is the one everyone remembers. It was session drummer Andy White at the kit. But for some reason, we ended up pressing the take that had Ringo on it first.
So, George, and this is to George Martin, what do you do? How do you break news to somebody like Pete Best, who is a tremendous talent on the drum kit?
Well, I wasn't the one who actually told him. That was Brian Epstein who did that. He didn't, of course, he didn't take the news very well, but he, apparently at first neither did the fans. Yeah, it's true, George. When I first debuted at the Cavern, half of them hated me, half of them loved me. And I actually got into a fight with one of them. Like he was being exceptionally rude to Ringo, and I said, "I'll piss off," and he ended up, he ended up bashing me, and I ended up with a black eye. These guys fought for me.
I'll say.
Yeah, and they won. In between, well, Love Me Do actually only came to the charts on number 17 in Britain anyway. But I in those days it was commonplace for record producers to find material for the artists, and I happened upon one track by Mitch Murray called "How Do You Do It." It wasn't the best thing I'd ever heard, but I did, and we did actually record it. John took the lead on it, but they were very reluctant to issue it because they felt like it would diminish their appearance. So we never actually issued "How Do You Do It," although I did later give it to Jerry and the Pacemakers, which led to them hitting the top chart before the Beatles did. And, well, of course, I did ask them if they had anything else to offer. And we did actually have one song that I had been working on. I was originally doing it as kind of like a slow Roy Orbison kind of thing. It was actually a song called "Please Please Me," and George Martin thought the song itself was good, but the tempo, meaning how fast it was, or slow, it was too. He felt it was too slow. He wanted to energize it a bit, so he asked us if we could play it faster, and even before John added his harmonica to the recording, after I heard it, I was able to say, "I think you may, congratulations, lads, I think you might have your first number one." And sure enough, it was. And after recording those two singles and the B-sides of them, that means the songs are on the opposite end. George, why don't you go into it? Well, I felt I needed to have an album out for the Beatles, and I said, "Well, why don't we just record every song you've got, and go through it in just one day?" And that's exactly what we did. But it was that last track. Well, 4 of the songs were already recorded. The other 10 were done in that 1 day period. But it was that final track at the end, and "Twist and Shout," that one almost killed me. I couldn't sing the damn thing. I was just screaming. Well, we knew we could only give it 1 or 2 goes because John's voice was starting to to go all day. So basically, we actually nailed it on we actually got it on the first attempt, and basically, if you listen carefully on the end of the record, you can hear me yell, "Oh yeah!" Because I was like, we had done it.
Can I ask one question? I just want to go back to Peter Best for a moment. What happened to Peter's career after the Beatles?
Well, he tried to go it solo with his own band, but later, none of us actually kept in touch with him, to be honest. But we found out that he was at least trying. He later ended up actually at a very popular vineyard, and he actually owned it. His mother did actually, and he inherited it. But however, upon unearthing these tracks that he was drumming for, we're planning on actually releasing them soon as part of this, as a companion piece to this podcast.
It's amazing.
And I actually made contact with Pete, and we've decided that he will be getting long overdue yes, royalties from it. And for every song that has him on it, he'll be getting royalties for every time it's used, and how many copies of the album are sold. So at least he can't say he got nothing from being a Beatle.
Absolutely would agree with that. So I want to pause. This has been a tremendous start. I have learned so much just in this short amount of time. And I think what's fascinating is the organic way that things came together, because you all came from different places. But
even though we were all based in Liverpool,
you were, but just, different ages, different places, different periods of your life. But one commonality drew you all in, and that is your love for music.
Specifically rock and roll.
It's inspiring to see people as young as you were at that time
actually
to follow your dreams.
Well, there was one slight hiccup in my plan, and tell you the truth, I did have a girlfriend at the time. Her name was Cynthia Powell. She was in my lettering class at the Liverpool Art College, and then we were not long after Pete had left. She and I were just taking a walk down by the pier, and she had this absolutely horrifying-eyed look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that she was pregnant and that I was the father. And that was a huge shock, but she didn't know what we were going to do. And I said, well, there's only one thing we can do, Sin. We'll have to get married. And in those days of Beatlemania, she actually tried to keep her very existence a secret, because it wouldn't do for the frenzied fans to know that I was both married and about to be a father. and our son was born in April of '63, just after the release of Please Please Me, and when we were deciding on a name for him, it was Cynthia who decided on the name Julian after my mother. When I first held my son in my arms, I was like, "Oh God, he's bloody marvelous," and then I whispered to him, he was going to be a famous little rocker like his dad. And but she, even though I was over the moon, when at that point, we knew that if the fans found out, we felt that if the fans found out, it was gonna be chaos.
I will say this, John, Paul, George, Ringo, and obviously you as well, George Martin.
Yeah.
I can't thank you enough for where we're at this point. This is such a cliffhanger for me, knowing so little about the background, because here we are, and this will set the stage for the next episode. You've just released...
We just released our first album. I also just became a father.
You had your first hit single.
Yes, the first hit single, Please Please Me. But
And the world...
not quite. We were already about to stomp on Britain, and it was after one performance in particular that the term Beatlemania came into existence. But one thing that we made clear to Brian and to George Martin is that we would not go to America until we actually had a number one over there.
And I think that we will leave that hanging for our listeners, because when we come back for the next episode, that's where we'll start. So to close down for today, I wanted to give all four of you, and George Martin, you as well, I wanted to give you all 10 seconds to either hum what's on your mind, or why don't we stay with that? What Beatles tune is, if you could hum it for us?
Well, there was one I did all the time when I was still with Rory and with the Beatles. I sang the song "Boy." Is it, I've been told when a boy is a girl, take a trip around the world. Hey, hey.
Very nice. All right, good one for you. Who's next?
That would probably be me. There was one song I did on Please Please Me. I didn't write it, but it was like, listen, do you want to know a secret?
Very nice.
One of the ones I remember fondly doing was a taste of honey, a taste of honey, tasting much richer than wine. And for me, even though it wasn't in that period, half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia.
George Martin, I can see why you were so excited the second that you met these individuals.
I can't actually play it, but right now, but I did do a little bit of piano playing on some of those numbers. But probably the one that stands out the most to me is the one I did on the track "In My Life" from the Rubber Soul album. That I almost forgot about that one. That's actually one of the most personal things I ever wrote. Though I know I'll never lose affection for people and things that went before. I know I'll often stop and think about them. In my life, I love you more.
Well done. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, lads. Thank you, George. Until we meet again.
We'll meet again. I don't know where, don't know when. Peace and love, everyone.
Peace and love.